We're good to go. Why don't we get started? So, as I mentioned earlier, today is we're talking about how to plan and execute a sourcing event. We have covered 3 webinars in the past, and in this part of the strategic sourcing webinar series, we've reached kind of the midpoint. So, what I will do is initially, I will introduce myself. Some of you may be new, so I just thought you will learn a little bit about myself. Ram Raghuraman, you might have known. I'm one of the directors of ISM-INDIA. I'm a CPSM certified procurement professional. I'm also the founder of a procurement consulting and services company called BQ Global Solutions, based in Chennai, India. And I have, I mentioned my relationship with ISM-INDIA. I've also worked in the US across a variety of roles, managing 100 million of spend in transportation sourcing, in lean manufacturing as well. My specialties are analytics, strategic sourcing, low-cost country sourcing, vendor management, category management, and I also retain an interest in sports, entrepreneurship, and volunteering. And to talk about my education, I received my bachelor's degree at the University of Madras in India. Then I went on, worked in India for a few years, went on to the US to get myself an MBA from the Purdue University in the US. And I mentioned I'm also CPSM certified. So I have a breadth and length of experience in procurement across the globe. I've worked with suppliers from China, Mexico, Europe, North America, so the entire deal. So that's a little bit about me. What is going to be our agenda for today? Today we're going to be talking about how to prepare and execute flawless sourcing events. Initially, since I had mentioned we're about the midway through the strategic sourcing webinar series, I'll do a quick recap, perhaps over the first 10 minutes or 15 minutes over what was covered in the webinars 1 to 3. You can also look these up on the ISM-INDIA website. We have recorded and posted YouTube links for all the webinars. Feel free to, if you want a closer look at all the topics that were covered in the previous webinars, feel free to head over to the ISM-INDIA site. We will then take a look at the various steps involved in preparing and executing the sourcing event, one of which is supplier identification and generation. What are the sources of getting supplier information? How do you qualify suppliers? How do you make sure the good suppliers participate in your sourcing event? And then we will move on to the actual sourcing event. What are the various types of sourcing events? Which type should you follow? And ultimately, towards the end, the last 15 minutes or so, we will have a quick recap, if time permits, or if not, we'll open the floor for questions. I hope everybody is ready. So why don't we get started? This is part of the recap session. So we initially talked about strategic sourcing as a step-by-step methodology, wherein you follow a set process to obtain the best results for your organization and for your team. We will take a look at the strategic sourcing process in a nutshell. We will also take a look at spend analysis and category strategy. So prior to even getting involved with the strategic sourcing process, I'd like to talk to you about this is what we call the Procurement House. The Procurement House is nothing but a a series of elements that contribute to the efficiency of your procurement organization. It is top down. You take a look, there are three elements to this. One is the strategic element, which includes stuff like the organization structure, how the procurement team is organized, what are the various governance structures in place, and the various processes that you follow. The next important thing, the next important aspect of a procurement house is what we call daily work. This is what you and I do when we go to work. We procurement professionals they play a strategic role, because not only are they managing stakeholder expectations, that is your corporate expectations in, be it cost savings or be it supply targets, we are also managing our suppliers as well. So supplier relationship management and stakeholder management on either sides, and we also do our daily work in the form of either category management, project management, or following the requisition to pay process. And the base of the procurement house consists of all the execution tools that we use to be better at work. So this can be, we need to be frequently trained, we need to use a lot of e-tools to perform analytics, we need a lot of reports and intelligence, and we also need to have a strategic sourcing methodology. There are a lot more aspects to it, but because of the space constraint, I was able to put only a few. But overall, I hope you get an idea of the various aspects of procurement. Moving on, so now we have the structure in place, we have a foundation in place, we have the procurement strategy in place, we know what everybody's roles and responsibilities are within the procurement team. There may be buyers that go out and are transactional, there may be category managers that are managing categories, and we also have a suite of tools that help us in performing these actions. So we are now ready for what we call the strategic sourcing. So what is the strategic sourcing process? Loosely, it's a sequence of several steps, the first of which is preliminary research, and I think this is what I call inward looking. If you want to enter a strategic sourcing exercise, you need to understand yourself better. When I say yourself, I'm talking about the organization, what you spend, which suppliers you're working with, what are the various volumes like, how are the suppliers performing price-wise, understand forecasts for the coming year and for beyond, understand what are the various specifications, and it also involves a lot of preliminary research about the various categories that you buy. The next step is once you have a good idea of yourself, the next step is outward looking. You can extend the analysis and get a better understanding of the supply market. You perform, there are several ways to do this. You do VAV reviews with your suppliers. You understand the supply market complexity. You try to understand what your bargaining position is in terms of a negotiation. Understand the supply market's bargaining position. Try to categorize your spend into strategic segments, and then treat each segment differently and have appropriate sourcing approaches and techniques for each. The next is a lot of this will be covered at this webinar, where how you plan and execute the sourcing event, which is an important aspect of this, is you generate suppliers that participate in it, identify criterion for evaluating suppliers. You have an internal project implementation plan, as well as an RFP execution strategy. So we will talk a little bit more about this in detail, so I will skip through this. After we perform the sourcing exercise, the next step is implementation planning. So where we need to do a lot of negotiation, develop award scenarios, execute agreements, and so on. So the last two steps will be covered in the coming webinars. So I will talk a lot more about that then. Ultimately, once you have all this in place, this is a constant exercise, performance monitoring, where you review the performance of the supply base, constantly take feedback, make changes to your strategic sourcing process, and essentially your continuous improvement process is the performance monitoring. So this is what I call the 5-step sourcing process. There are a lot of these variations. Most consultants will talk about, you know, a 10-step or a 13-step or a 7-step process. But essentially, the bulk of it boils down to these various tasks in the strategic sourcing process. A lot of you may already be aware of this, so please feel free to share any thoughts or comments. An important aspect of the first part, preliminary research, is understanding your spend, what you're currently spending. And in order for you to develop a clear understanding, I would you know, like you to look at your spend data. The spend data can be in the form of your accounts payable files. It can be, you have to collate all the spend information, and then try to view it using these 3 parameters. You know, try to understand who are you buying from. Try to understand what you're buying, and also for who are we buying. So for who is nothing but the cost center. So for a particular organization, there may be several cost centers. So these are the 3 axes of what I call the spend cube. So can be who are you buying from, who are you buying for, and what you're buying. So armed with this knowledge, you can have this is paramount. This is very important for you to perform a strategic sourcing exercise. I talked to you about supply market analysis, and this is a simple way to do it. So this is a commonly adopted technique called the Porter's 5 forces analysis, where you basically try to understand, one, for a particular category, for example, you might be the category manager for metals, or you can be the category manager for a particular product. So one, you try to understand the various new entrants. When I say new entrants, I'm talking about suppliers. So you talk about new suppliers that are in the market, understand the various buyers, who the buyers are, try to perform a SWOT analysis, try to see what their capabilities are, as well as identify if there are any substitutes for the product that you're purchasing. For example, if you look at, if you're currently purchasing a product such as, you know, maybe as simple as a writing device, a pen. A pencil is a substitute for a pen, even though it provides the same function, although in a different manner. So that is what we call substitutes. And you also try to understand the various suppliers. So all these put together is what is the supply market, and you also try to understand the various rival forces at work. So all the while, what you're trying to do when you're performing the supply market analysis is try to get an idea of, you know, what are the forces at work, what are the drivers that drive supplier competitiveness. If there are a successful competitor of yours, try to understand what they're doing right, what you're doing wrong, and try to make the necessary changes. Ultimately, you should try to understand how you can use the supply market dynamics to your advantage. This should be done across all categories, for every category. Each category's supply market is different, so please take that into consideration. Once you understand the supply market, the next step involved is trying to frame a strategy for your category. So I talked a lot about this in the previous webinar, but you try, I'll just skip through a lot of the detail, but at a high level, what are the various elements that should be part of a category strategy? A category strategy is not static. I'd like to call it a living, breathing document that constantly adapts itself to the changing environment. But the elements of the category strategy should remain the same. They are One, spend information, which we already discussed. You have to slice and dice your particular category, try to get a comprehensive idea. You should have all the information at your fingertips. You should know who you're buying for, who you're buying from, and what you're buying. Market information, which we also saw. You understand the various players, their size, the geography, their capabilities. Armed with that knowledge, you can then perform a supplier SWOT analysis as well as value stream analysis, where you essentially understand the product or the category that you're purchasing across the entire value stream, break it down into as many silos as possible, and finally, try to identify which direction the product or the category that you're buying is headed. Try to look out, what will change over the next year, over the next couple of years, over the next 5 years and 10 years. Ultimately, it should evolve into your category strategy. It is imperative that you have both a strategy that will work for you in the short term as well as in the long term. The next step is also trying to evolve your sourcing strategy based on the category that you're purchasing. So I mentioned earlier, each category is different. So it is important to have a particular sourcing strategy for a specific category. So what are the various sourcing strategies? Largely, it can be into two broad areas. One is where it's a competitive environment where you try to encourage competitiveness among your supply base, and the other strategy is where you get into a development mode. You work with your suppliers, you treat them as part of your own, and then you try to come up with a superior product or a service together. So it can be, you can either work with your suppliers to on VAV events, work with their engineering teams, use substitute materials and exploring alternatives. You can also perform joint process improvement where you work together with the suppliers, you re-engineer processes, you treat them essentially as an extension of your company, try to see if there are any particular productivity gains that you can share by combining processes at your organization as well as your supplier organization. You can also develop an integrated supply chain by identifying key suppliers. Where you're completely open with them. There is a lot of information sharing. You identify key suppliers, you work with them, and ultimately it's developing strategic alliances and partnerships. So this is one half of a source of broadly a development sourcing strategy. The other is the competitive aspect, where you try to a global sourcing strategy, where if you're in a region that has a high cost, try to identify suppliers in lower cost regions, profit from the global supply demand imbalances and the various costs at different parts of the globe. You perform for certain categories. It might be wise to, where there is very little differentiation, it might be wise to just perform a comprehensive price evaluation and focus solely on price. You have to take this with a pinch of salt, because there are certain categories where price is not the only defining factor. So there are other aspects to it as well. And another strategy is where you concentrate volume. So wherein you will have 10 suppliers supplying the same product, you consolidate your spend and try to move to a fewer supplier. You try to increase the business that you do with a particular supplier, and you bring down your supply base, because there is a certain cost involved with interacting with several suppliers. So these are broadly the 6 sourcing strategies that you follow. As I mentioned, one, the 3 on the left is where you exploit the buying power, and The three on the right is where you work with your supplier to create an advantage for yourself. So this was what was covered over the past 3 webinars. So moving ahead, we will take a look at the topic for this seminar, this webinar, which is essentially preparing and deploying the sourcing event. The first aspect of conducting a flawless sourcing event is, a sourcing event is only as good as the suppliers that are involved in it. So there may be, a few hidden gem of a supplier that you possibly do not include in the bidding process at all. Thereby, you completely eliminate the process, the possibility of having a great supplier working for you. So take care in trying to research the supply base and try to include as many suppliers as possible. It is also important that for each sourcing exercise, you try to include, as a practice, this is what I used to do, is try to include a few new suppliers in each sourcing exercise. To work with the same number of suppliers over and over again is you might be effective as you were. So what are the various steps in supplier identification? Number 1 is where you first set the criteria that you want. When you're looking for a particular supplier, set yourself, the criteria can be anything from size, can be anything from product supplied, it can be anything from geographic locations. So try to set clear criteria on try to visualize, who an ideal supplier would be, and try to create all the various criteria for supplier identification. The next step is when you actually go out and identify. So you trawl through multiple databases, you perform research online, you reach out to trade organizations. So you try to identify, you come up with essentially a long list of suppliers. No need to worry about the criteria yet, because don't write off suppliers at this stage. The goal is to identify as many suppliers as possible. The longer term, the longest that it takes in this supplier identification process is what is called the screening. So you have established criteria. All you need to do now is to have the supplier long list and try to screen the suppliers based on the criteria that you've established. This is a fairly long process, typically when the number of suppliers is large. And ultimately, after you perform the screening, you then qualify the suppliers that pass through. I have a little more about this in the coming slides, so I will talk about the key for doing this is we have to eliminate any assumptions that we make about our supply base. The key is to know a lot about what the suppliers bring to the table, so you can make educated decisions and minimize the number of assumptions that you make. So I talked about evaluation criteria, I talked about identifying the suppliers, talked about screening and selection, as well as qualification, wherein you ultimately end up with the short list of suppliers that you want to participate in your sourcing exercise. So we know that we need to get a list of suppliers to participate in our sourcing exercise. But how would you go about doing that? For that, I would think it's important to classify your supply base into 3. Number 1 is your primary source of suppliers, which will be your current supply base. This is who you have established relationships with, you have been working with them in the past. And the sources for these primary suppliers are typically internal databases. You can look through your AP data, you can look through mailing lists that your organization has, purchasing files, or internal interviews. So be sure to involve, engineering, maybe working with a particular supplier can provide this category or service that you're looking for. So make sure you consider all sources to come up with a primary list of suppliers. The second portion of this is what we call secondary suppliers or alternative suppliers. often, these are, you can think of competitors of your current suppliers. They are pretty similar in terms of the goods and services offered. This can also potentially include suppliers that you had relationships with in the past, but you're currently not working with the suppliers. These are what we call alternative suppliers, the sources of which are listed below, where you trawl through industry databases, you perform a lot of interviews. Trade organizations will give you the list of alternative supply. Now, coming into the left field, so it is important to include other suppliers as part of your exercise as well. This is what we call exception or non-traditional suppliers. They are, largely speaking, they don't market the same goods as the current supplier or the ideal supplier base that you want, but with some tweaking, they have some untested capabilities that you see in them. You think they can provide value to your organization. I think they have a chance, they deserve a chance to be included as well. This is to include, exception-based suppliers or non-traditional suppliers can sometimes lead to a gold mine where you're currently viewing a product or a service a certain way. With the help of non-traditional suppliers, you can dramatically change the way you look at a product or a service. So so the sources for such suppliers are you completely change track. You look at different markets, different industries, and you also try to identify substitutes that we talked about earlier. This is a fairly important process in the sourcing event, because the more aggressive that you are in trying to identify all these suppliers, the more gains you can potentially have when you're doing the sourcing exercise. So think of the supplier screening process. We talked about the supplier screening process. Think of it as a long funnel. So step one is where you end up with a long list of suppliers. I've just put a number out there. It can be anything. Just to make this clear, I just wanted to use a number. So 100, let's say you end up, after the previous exercise, you end up with a supplier long list of 100 suppliers. This is step one of the screening process. The next step is where you do the initial screen that we talked about, which will dramatically reduce the number of suppliers in your long list. So you end up with a list of, let's say, 40 suppliers. So the screen, we talk about the various evaluation criteria. Those can include, financial stability, market share, breadth of products, and so on. The next step after you perform your initial screen is a commonly used tool called the request for information. So this is basically where you've screened your suppliers. You think, let's say from 100, you have 40 suppliers that you think can supply this product to you, and you send out a lengthy questionnaire where you try to gauge your supplier about their service response time, how they manage assets, what delivery quality processes they have, how are they very innovative, what are their technological capability, and so on. So this is largely where you send out the questionnaire to suppliers and they respond. This is basically a test of sorts. So you send this questionnaire to suppliers, they take their own time, typically about a week or so, and they get back to you with all the questions that you asked. You try to gauge their, as I mentioned, the response times, how they manage assets, and so on, as a result of the RFI. Now, the next step after this RFI is a further refinement of the suppliers, where you ultimately try to end up with a short list of suppliers that you want to participate in your event. So typically this is about 10% of the original list that you started out with. You try to understand how they perform, have criteria to understand their reliability and the overall quality that they bring to the table. So think of it as a large funnel. And this entire process is a process of getting to know your suppliers. And this is all for, this can include all the three sources, all the three types of suppliers that I talked about. It can be your primary suppliers, it can be your secondary, as well as your non-traditional suppliers. But ultimately, you want to make sure the suppliers that participate in the sourcing event are each capable of winning the business. You don't want a supplier, that you see no chance of participating and making a value proposition to your organization to be a part of the sourcing event. Ideally, you should narrow it down to a manageable number of suppliers. You don't want a lot of suppliers bidding, because then it becomes a problem of trying to compare the several bids. Be fully confident that the list that you end up with, all the suppliers that are part of the list are capable of providing that product or service to you at the best estimated cost and your conditions that you have. Once you've completed this process, you're now ready to hold the sourcing event. And what is the sourcing event that I'm talking about? There are, several types of sourcing events. The most common ones being, a traditional RFP that we are used to doing, and a lot of it a new. I wouldn't call it new anymore, because it's been around for close to 7-8 years. Is reverse auctions. I earlier mentioned, it can either be a competitive bidding process or a dedicated supplier development model. Most sourcing exercises are typically competitive supplier selection events, wherein it is either a traditional RFP where you send the bidding documents to various suppliers, you give them a specific time to respond, you clearly set them criteria and how you expect them to bid, and they respond to you. And once this is an entirely offline process where you send the bidding documents to them, they respond, and then you analyze the bids. An e-auction is also popular, and increasingly more companies are moving towards leveraging. There are several tools available online that can host an auction. Essentially, this is where suppliers bid. So it's why it is called a reverse auction, is that in a typical auction, when you're bidding for a product, the price goes up. But in a reverse auction, this is where suppliers are bidding for your business, the price is bound to go down. There are several sourcing platforms that enable you to do that. And the supplier development model, I already mentioned to you the joint process improvement, where you re-engineer processes and you also perform VAVE. So largely, sourcing events can be categorized into one among these four types. But the care, in a competitive bidding scenario, you should be careful to select the right sourcing event type. So it can either be done on a traditional RFP basis, or it can be done on a reverse auction basis. But how do you choose which one to go for? It is completely based on the category that you're sourcing and a lot of other conditions as well. We will take a look at a few of them here. So as you can see, on top you have the purple marker, which is for auctions, and the blue marker, which is for traditional RFPs. And you also have the middle ground, where you combine elements of both the auction as well as a traditional RFP in your sourcing event. So one way of classifying or choosing the right sourcing type is based on the level of information that you have about your parts. If your part detail information is very simple and clear, perhaps e-auction would be a right way. Over when the parts are fairly complex, the drawings are complex, they require a lot of back and forth between you and the buying organization. Drawings or specifications, perhaps a longer process, a traditional RFP is more suited. Bidding is another area where there is very little time to bid and rebid. You should choose an e-auction where bidding is fairly easy. it is typically only price that is the determining factor. Perhaps e-auction, suppliers can make the decision in minutes whether to bid or rebid. Then an auction is perhaps the best way. Versus if it requires a lot of analysis, clarifications, then a traditional RFP is the way to go. The other aspect is the pricing components, the various components that make up the goods or service that you have. If the number of cost elements are a lot, if there is a lot of detail required, then perhaps you need to follow a traditional RFP. If there are very few cost elements, if there are very less detail, then auction is the way to go. Imagine an auction is something that can, get done in a couple of hours. The entire sourcing exercise gets done in a few hours, whereas in an RFP, it takes a few weeks typically, maybe even a month in certain cases. So obviously e-auction delivers a lot of efficiencies in gains in your time. But again, like I mentioned, it's not for all types of products or goods or services. And when I just say it takes a few hours to complete, it's just the sourcing event that takes a few hours. Of course, the preparation time for the auction is significant. You need to ensure that you set it up right. So a lot of preparation is required, which is the same for the traditional RFP as well. The other qualifying criteria is pricing analysis, whether there are manual pricing calculations that you need to do, or there is a high level of detail that needs to be provided. If it's simple, real-time, and automated, auction is the way to go. If there are sophisticated reports and a lot of manual inputs, perhaps you should consider a traditional RFP. The last aspect of it is a soft element, which is the amount of information that you share. If the information that you want to share is easily understood, it can be just posted on the web. Participants can just look it up and try to glean as much as they can, and they have a full understanding of how to participate in the auction, how to participate in the sourcing exercise, then auction is the way to go. However, on the other hand, in specific cases, information needs to be, there needs to be a certain level of human contact, and you control the feedback that is shared between the supply base, because the auction is something that is fairly out in the open. So any feedback that is shared between the supply base, it is open for all the participants to see. Wherein you want to control the level of feedback, level of information that the suppliers can see, you should perhaps look at a traditional RFP. But largely, if you were to, I think we're down to the last couple of slides here. These, I think, are the two important aspects of the sourcing exercise. One is what you should try to get out of what are the various objectives of the sourcing exercise, and the last slide will be on a common mistake performed by procurement professionals across the globe, across the, be it at a small company or a large company. We'll get to that later. But what are the objectives of the sourcing exercise? You have to understand 4 major areas. One is try to understand, let me get all the information out to you. One is, we'll go top. The green element talks about comparative economics. So essentially, as part of the sourcing exercise, what you're trying to do is evolve an apples to apples comparison of the various bids. Identify the strengths and weaknesses of the suppliers across the goods or services being bid. The red element talks about changing the basis of bids. So where you have to understand that in a sourcing exercise, sometimes certain suppliers will propose different terms. They will completely change the basis of the bids that you have proposed, and sometimes it may be worthwhile considering those as well. So before the sourcing exercise, you have to be prepared for any of those new, where what we call the basis of bids. The sourcing exercise also is your first interview of sorts with the supplier you have to try to gain as much information about their bidding behavior, the way they interact with you, and this will have a bearing. This will help you a lot during the contract and negotiation phase, where you try to understand their behavior and you frame your negotiation strategy accordingly. But ultimately, this is the central objective of the sourcing exercise, is to present a value proposition to the supplier. So relationship is a two-way street. You have to understand that as long as you make the suppliers feel valued and important, you will gain their trust. Typically, buying organizations always consider their needs to be met. Of course, it is important for their needs to be met, but you should also consider what moves the chains for the suppliers. The advantage should be shared typically between both you, the purchasing organization, as well as the supplier. So the sourcing exercise should clearly communicate the value of the relationship to the supplier. So it can either be in terms of scope of goods or services, and it can be in terms of future businesses that they can win, their strategic importance to you as an organization. And so ultimately, you want to make the supplier feel valued in the relationship. So these four are the critical objectives of the sourcing exercise. And I want to close this webinar off with an important area that is often overlooked in a sourcing exercise. This can make or break a particular sourcing event. Communication. Consistent communication is the key to the success of, I put down as RFP, but it's a sourcing event. So consistent communication across the board is very important, both internally as well as externally. So it's important to engage the various stakeholders before, during, and after the sourcing event. So right from the time that you're thinking about organizing a sourcing event, it is important that you engage the various stakeholders. By stakeholders, I mean it can be different departments, it can be senior management, it can be different departments like engineering, your sales force. All the departments need to be involved, or at least communicated to what you're trying to achieve with this sourcing event. Communication, as I mentioned, can be internal and it can be external as well. Sorry about the icons there, I forgot to change them, it looks like. But what are the things that you want to communicate to them? One, the key is you have to get them on board about the strategy. What are you trying to, what are your objectives? What are the timing for these events? Let's say Q3 of this year or something like that. You have to communicate all this to both the internal as well as external stakeholders. It is important that they stay in the loop throughout, because ultimately typically when the other stakeholders need to be involved is what we call supplier integration or supplier onboarding. So the more they are clued in to the sourcing exercise, the more they will aid you during following exercise. One is the plan, where you clearly have a cross-functional team. You identify people that are going to partner with you in the sourcing exercise, and champions, typically from senior management, that are pushing the sourcing exercise. You also look at infrastructure. You lay down, you plan for the schedule of these. So typically, it is a sourcing exercise across a company will involve multiple categories. So it is important to schedule a sourcing exercise. So consultants typically will advise you to perform sourcing events in waves. These the various projects are chosen according to multiple criteria. One, it can be based on how much savings that they can generate. Two, it can be based on priority or an immediate need. It can be based on the complexity of holding such an exercise. So it is important to consider all these criteria and schedule a sourcing exercise into multiple waves. Key also should be the various processes. You should try to standardize the process of a sourcing exercise so as to minimize any confusion. And I'm saying this to depth, but this is very important, is constant review and feedback. You involve all stakeholders, try to get their feedback on what is working and what is not working, and ultimately you also recalibrate. You get their feedback and see what are the problem areas that are limiting you from performing a flawless sourcing exercise, and you recalibrate and you do it all over again. So this till slide 18. Yep, slide 18 is the last slide. So what I had was just my contact information. This was the end of the webinar, and I really do hope I will reach out to all the attendees as well. I see a few people had dropped off, but this is my information. Please do feel free to give me a call or email me at any time if you have any questions, and I will, in the interest of time, what I will do now is give an opportunity for those who want to share their, if you can raise your hand if you want